Right, hi guys. This is obviously a little bit overdue, but we're doing a cat chat. It's live this time, which is a little bit bizarre, but here we are. So we've got a couple of topics to talk about. We've got Nathria, we've got Sanctum of Domination, we've got some other stuff. But of course, we've got Zan here, and we've got some questions from everyone else. Hi, Zan.
Hello.
So the first topic we have on the list, we wanted to talk about how Feral performed in Castle Nathria. Obviously, I think our last cat chat was before Castle Nathria. I think we might have had a bit of talk about how we think Feral will end up doing. But now that Castle Nathria has ended, we can kind of discuss how we think it went for Feral, or how it went in general.
It's funny because I think we speculated a lot about legendaries before that trade, and then we used drought for everything. Not literally, but
we did end up using drought a lot more than we thought we would originally. The issues it had of it being pure single target kind of didn't end up being hugely relevant, since the raid just had a lot of single target going on, which was kind of cool. I mean, we used some different legendaries. There was a circle fight or two. There was an apex
slightly
fight.
Facetious, of course, to say that we only used one, but still, it was way more dominant than we thought.
It was definitely much more dominant than we originally thought it was going to be. Yeah, but that's kind of cool. Right. So Castle Nathria happened. There were a few fights. While I think Feral was pretty good overall, there were a few fights where Feral was notoriously bad. So while it was pretty good on average, we could talk about fights like Sunking Salvation, which is obviously a niche fight for us. It wasn't really a fight where we performed on DPS. We can talk about Stone Legion Generals, and we can talk about God, what was it? Council of Blood was a tragedy for us.
Yeah. And I feel like it goes into the normal weaknesses Fel has all of these bosses, especially Stone Legion Generals, right?
Yes.
Which is basically a burst AoE fight, right? That's a lot of the difficulty anyway.
Yes, the fight ended up being how quickly can you kill the ads in order to keep them under control. Because when you're trying to control ads, but you're trying to control ads with damage over time, things kind of just tick down. So at the end of the day, all those fights where you have to sort of control ads very quickly just turn into a fight where you just load up all of your burst damage and just one-shot the ads whenever possible. Which is kind of a little bit degenerate and it's kind of a little bit sad, but it is just a typical like Feral bad fight, unfortunately.
It's nothing new. The only fight that we were accidentally good was when BRS was strong in like Nighthold, essentially. That's the only time we've been good at that type of fight in this spec's history, essentially.
Nighthold. And I guess and Taurus as well. Feral had some brutal slash moments there. We can talk about brutal slash later because that's kind of an interesting one. Council of Blood was a weird fight because it's kind of a fight which Feral should be good at. Because burst AoE is not hugely important, very single target focused. But unfortunately, we're kind of convoke cats at the moment, which means that any fight where there's multiple targets and you can only do damage to one is a little no bueno for us.
And I mean, it's also, I think, fair to say that Council of Blood, we are probably a lot closer to being, average spec. But because, well, especially Balance was so obscenely much better than everyone else, and it's like Affliction, etc., also extremely good in the fight, it becomes...
Council of Blood was a bit of a mess in terms of statistics, yeah.
Yeah. So, like, I don't think that Feral was clearly not very good at this, but I do think we were a lot closer to the average on this fight than like on Stone Legion, for example, right?
That's probably fair enough. I think that Feral could have made more of a place in Stone Legion than it did in Council of Blood if Council of Blood was a harder fight.
Yeah, sure.
If Council of Blood was like an actually hard fight, then I think it would have been really rough for us because Convoke just hitting random targets, it just neuters so much of our burst. So you kind of just end up in this shitty position. But
especially it becomes so extremely high roll as well. If you end up luckily and all the bites go on right target, it's super good. And the next pull, like you get no bites on a good target, and it's like, well.
Yeah, And really, the way Convoke interacts with us, with Taste for Blood and with Sabretooth, you lose such relatively more value from Convoke hitting the wrong stuff than you might do in the past. Because, we've never had Convoke with us, but in the past, other designs. Because you lose more than just the damage, you also lose all the secondary effects that we have going on with bites from Convoke and stuff like that.
And more targets also causes it cost more rakes and stuff like that as well.
Especially when those rakes don't actually do anything. So
yeah,
I think that was a rough fight for us. Sun King Salvation was really interesting because we were really good on that fight, despite it being a feral bad fight. But the reason we were really good on that fight is healing, which is an interesting one. It was very niche.
I mean, it is how you beat that fight, I guess.
Yeah, it was. We've not had that many fights sort of in that vein. Really, we had the ICC one and this one. I can't think of any others which have been.
There've been a few healing hasn't mattered, but like there were one in Mist as well. But yeah, those fights are very rare. They are always gimmicky as well.
But it was an interesting one. We all got to learn how to optimize how to heal as a feral druid. My guild still takes the mick of me because at one point I beat my resto pass as feral druid. So
yes, you do.
It's a bit of an awkward one. Some Convoke high rolls. But it's sometimes nice to be valuable on progress for something other than just DPS. You get to feel like a DK or a Demon Hunter when you press Darkness or something, except for healing the boss instead.
Yes.
Yeah. Utility, the eternal bugbear. But there were some fights in that tier that were actually really good for feral. That was kind of cool. So like Sludge Fist is the one that will always get raised, where feral doing single target kind of just got to smack a boss. We had decent, not great CD timings, but and being very bursty with Convoke and with Berserk. And I mean, we didn't have perfect CD timings for the vulnerable phases, but we had pretty good CD timings. It'd be interesting to see feral with Celestial on Sludge Fist, because I think it just would have been the best single spec in the game for that fight. Not that it wasn't already up there, but it would have been out of this world. But yeah, Celestial, we can talk about that later and how it impacts. But
it would have been interesting.
It
would have been interesting if Celestial was available in Nathria, actually.
Yeah, it would have been. I think it would have been interesting to see how people reacted in terms of looking at how feral was performing. Because it definitely gives us a niche that we haven't really had in the past, that kind of 1 minute CD timing burst.
Yeah.
Which I think is actually one of the more valuable niches. If you're going to have CDs that are strong, having them on 1 minute is basically perfect, because it's very infrequent that burst windows aren't in like 1 minute multiples. It'll either be 2 minutes or very rarely 3 minutes, or it'll be 1 minute. So like stuff like Kingaroth, stuff like Sludge Fist. So Convoke does kind of hit everything we want.
And 1 minute cooldowns automatically also become 2 minute cooldowns, even if they're weaker.
Exactly, yeah.
So.
And even when you do get the occasional fight where it doesn't quite match up with what you're looking for, you just hold it a tiny little bit, lose a bit of overall, but you gain the benefit of having a CD for every burst phase, which is typically all that really matters. Denathrius was an interesting one. I think feral was actually really good on that fight and just looked really bad on statistics. Because so much of that fight was either burst damage or single target. So phase 3 damage or damage on the lieutenants. But so much of what ended up making specs valuable on the statistics was how much damage it could do in phase 1 in the pad shit.
Yeah.
But
it is really interesting on statistics, if you flick from damage to bosses and how the picture completely changes.
Yes. And how that changes what specs you probably think are good on that. I think I've said a few times that I think that Feral probably should have been in World First. It's an interesting one to talk about because obviously I don't have the perspective of this. I haven't really talked to anyone from any of the top guilds. So the interesting question is, are they just overlooking Feral, or do they actually think Feral is bad? My assumption and what I would assume is that they're overlooking it. They don't have anyone who plays Feral. They don't have anyone who focuses on Feral, so they just move on past it. They don't consider it. But
I think that if you're in a world where you're absolutely maximizing everything, I think that there are probably some cases where Farah should have been in, like some fight. I just don't think that there had necessarily been a point where like the spec adds so much over something else that it matters significantly that you bring it. But I do think that there
yes,
have been some fights where very clearly the spec has been very, very strong.
I think that's a reasonable point. If it's only good on a few fights, then it's, as much as it hurts my ego, it's probably not worth picking it up just for those few fights, unless those few fights are extremely hard, because you do also have to use it on the other fights. So if you have something that's a better odds, then
Yes, I think that if you were a guild like that and you actually had a really good feral on stuff that like wanted to play the spec, basically I think you would have been able to fit in on a bunch of fights and it would have been perfectly reasonable, or maybe optimal even. But it's just not one of those cases where I don't think the spec is brings so much on something that it's necessarily worth adding
exactly
it. Yeah.
having somebody to play it, gearing it, all for
Yeah, exactly. Like that's
yeah.
gonna be a bigger risk than just getting your druid to be boomkin, which is more likely to have a unique niche.
Fucking boomkins. It is an interesting one. I'd
It's
love to talk
unfortunate.
to someone about their thought process on that.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Was there anything else we wanted to talk about in Nathria? We kind of questioned whether it was overlooked. I think it was a little bit overlooked. I think it ended up performing really well. Did you have anything further you wanted to go into?
No, nothing specific about Nathria, I don't think.
Okay. We can look at Sanctum of Domination then, obviously, because that's a current raid, and it's interesting to talk about how Feral is currently doing. You're obviously raiding Sanctum of Domination. I am raiding Sanctum of Domination whenever I'm not on the bench. What do you think of the raid so far?
I think it's a weird raid, to
That's
be
probably fair
honest.
enough.
Like I think the raid itself, like I actually think that the heroic mechanics are good, but I
I'd agree
think
with
that this
that.
raid is weirdly tuned in Mythic. In every boss basically is weirdly tuned in Mythic. In a way where it's probably too easy for most guilds and was probably difficult in the wrong way for like the best guilds. That's my
That's
feeling about this place. Like I think that Mythic actually is quite mediocre as far as the tier goes, and I think a lot of that is just tuning. I think the raid is itself, like the mechanics and whatever, is and the boss designs are okay. If it was tuned better, I guess.
I'd agree. The mechanics are really good for the first half of the raid, for the latter half of the raid, and then it's just ruined by DPS stops and weird cheese, and I think it was
Yeah,
really close to being
DPS
good tier.
is a massive issue. Actually, it really is.
They just feel awful, and there's just so many of them this tier. I mean, there were a few last tier with Denathrius, with Council of Blood, but they really turned it up to 11 this tier. Especially in the latter half, like Painsmith, KT, even Fate Scribe, Sylvanas to a lesser extent. It's just, yeah. This tier had a lot of promise and ended up not really delivering, I think, which is a shame.
And I feel like this part of it is also, of course, you can't really disentangle the fact that this tier has dumb things like Corfia being extremely grindy and boring, and domination sockets being overpowered and stuff like that,
Yeah,
which does sour the experience a lot,
and
obviously.
Domination Socket obtaining them and then
Yeah, and also
upgrading and
conduit farming, and there's a bunch of stuff that's really dumb. But I think the raid itself is like the DPS stop just removes so much of the proper difficulty, in my opinion, on a lot of fights, and that's just a balance problem, really. Um, but I feel like that and some other tuning decisions are just that's a real issue with this tier. I actually think this tier is probably not, I think these bosses, like we could go through them, I guess, boss by boss if we want, but
I'm always down.
yeah.
All right, let's do that. So, Taragru. It's kind of a bit of a
super
gimmick fight, but
Yeah.
it was fine as far as a gimmick. It's kind of the same deal as Blackwater Behemoth, where like they can't stop themselves from doing a fight with a gimmick, so the fight was at least bearable with the gimmick.
I think putting a gimmicky boss like this first is fine. Like then it's
Yeah.
not too difficult. Yeah, like it's whatever.
If the boss was towards the end and you actually cared what anima powers
Yeah, exactly.
you had to get.
If this is ever difficult, it's a massive fucking issue. It's gonna be so annoying to do because you're just gonna have to reset.
Yeah.
It's so bad.
I think it was. Yeah, I think it ended up being okay. The mechanics are fine. The throughput check is whatever. I did see. I think Torty linked me a screenshot of a guild that they had all of their raiders spam reroll in order to get the power which removes a stack of a debuff randomly. So the one that makes you take like 99% reduced damage and removes a stack of a debuff. So they just had their entire raid reroll until they got that power and just took like 0 damage.
I mean, there are a lot of stuff you can do with this boss, but it's like it's so pointless. Like as far as
and let's be
such
real,
an easy fight.
You're never teaching your DPS to not take DPS powers. That's just not happening.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're struggling to teach them not to take griefing powers, right? So
definitely struggling. Some people do love their lumbering form. But hey, it's an early boss. It was fine for the gimmick of what it was. Great. Eye of the Jailer. I actually think this was one of the better designed fights of the tier. I actually quite enjoyed this fight.
Yeah. I think this is a good fight. I think there's some dumb bits about it, but as far as Fella's concerned, I think it's a good fight.
Well, what do you think is dumb about it?
No, I just have complaints about hitboxes. That doesn't matter for Fell. So I think this fight is good. I actually like this fight.
It's definitely a fight. I felt balanceability being valuable, especially when you get the slow and you can move really far up the side and still be able to hit the boss. That was really nice. Man, did people grief with beams, and it's not a fight that's tuned hard enough. You need to optimize that the DPS. I actually thought it was tuned fairly decently for the point it was in the raid. There was nice check with having to deal with the ads on both sides. I actually think Celestial was really good on this fight, because 1 minute convoke meant you could CD an ad and you still have it for boss, especially in last phase. So that was great. Big Celestial fight. Right, so the next fight, the 9. I have a lot of strong feelings about this fight, and they're not really good. And by strong feelings, I mostly mean neutral feelings. But how do you feel about the 9?
I think this fight is okay. So like I think this fight's biggest issue is that they tuned it a bit oddly, where the last bit of the fight that is the most boring is the longest, and it's very long for no real reason. But I think that it's an okay fight, I guess. It has a bit of those random like run out mechanics that are a bit frustrating and randomness and stuff, but I don't think it's too bad. It's okay for what it is. It's just a bit too long.
I just thought it was so long, and
yeah, it is definitely long.
There was never really any mechanics that felt threatening, so I was kind of just going along, living my life, not really concerned too much about dying. The debuff is the only thing that you really have to execute, and apart from that, you just hit the boss for 6, 7, 8 minutes, and eventually it dies and gives you a polearm.
Yeah, the only hard bit of the fight really is the phase where you have all 3 up, but it is extremely short and it is relatively early, which is really weird. I feel like that's just a health balance thing. Like if the first 2 mobs just had more health and the last one had less, I think it's a much better fight. Like you actually want that overlap phase to be longer.
Because the problem is the moment
really
you just send a lust and then you just blow everything up.
Yeah, exactly. And you have a lot of healing cooldowns and stuff, and it's fine. I don't know. But I think it's okay fight. Like I don't think it's a terrible fight. I just don't think it's as good as it could be. I guess it's very long and pretty boring. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much my feelings on it. So then you could choose 2 different directions to go. So you could go Remnant of Nozul or Soul Render. Out of curiosity, which direction did you go?
Remnant and then Soul Render.
But they ended up being more normal.
Reverse difficult. I think. Yeah, that's probably the more normal one.
I think most people went. We can start with Remnant, since that's the one we both went to first. I thought this fight was fine. There was some awkwardness with DPS stopping and DPS that they then attempted to later fix with a hotfix.
And bugs as well.
Oh man, the bugs.
This fight, I mean, this fight's hard to judge just because bugs and random timings and stuff like this probably screwed it up, I think. But I think the fight itself is probably okay baseline, right? I don't know.
Yeah,
What do you think?
probably fine baseline, but man, the bugs just they hard ruined my experience on this fight. Like we had a night where we spent basically the entire night to the bug with the orbs, where you throw the orbs up and they just don't go off. They just hang out, pulsing damage on everyone. Just yeah, this fight could have been fun, but I have a hard time separating my enjoyment from fight from like the bugs I had with the fight. So yeah, I thought it's another fight where. So we had DPS stops on progress, where it was really annoying getting overlaps of shattered and dispels. I thought it was kind of a weird fight with how important the mass dispels were. I'm not sure what the design intention for that fight was outside of. I mean, I guess it was that you have to get knocked both sides, but then with the third knock in the last phase,
I assume that's the plan.
Yeah, but then with the third knock you get from the chest in the last phase, it does become a little bit what is happening here. But fight was okay. Bugs sucked. Without the bugs, I think it would have been fine for where it was in the raid.
Yeah, I think maybe it would have been fine, but I do think this is one of those bosses with suspicious DPS stops that should probably not exist. Like I don't think I think it's weird with like these kinds of timings and buffer mechanics and stuff that really makes the fight like vary so much in difficulty, depending on basically. I think this is I think this is like the overarching theme of this tier, and I think this boss is really the first one that has a lot of random stop timings and random push timings, and it doesn't appear obvious why you would stop, but then suddenly then you push it wrong and it has a really weird overlap later on and you wipe or whatever.
You push it wrong and you get shatter plus orbs, you push it wrong and
exactly. And it's not obvious at all that that's going to happen. So it's one of those like hidden things that you need to do, but there's no like obvious reasons why. I think that's pretty bad design.
Definitely. I haven't actually done the fight since they hotfixed it, so I'm not sure if the hotfixes actually had the desired effect of making.
But I'd imagine it probably made it easier enough that it's less of an issue now. But yeah, it's
find out next week, I guess. But yeah, I think it was okay for where it was in the raid. Bugs sucked. It was definitely weird with DPS stops. And it was kind of a bit of a signal of what's to come with the rest of the raid. The start of the end, really. Right, so Soul Render. I think Soul Render is actually just maybe the best fight of the tier. Maybe some people say about the Painsmith, but I think they're just fucking wrong when they say that about Painsmith. I thought Soul Render was good. How did you feel about Soul Render?
It's okay, yeah, it's fine. Not having any weird mechanics. I think this is a good fight.
Not having the DPS stop.
Yeah, I exactly, but that's like, is that like the criteria we are judging on, right? It feels a bit like that almost, and that's a bit, sad, I guess. I think these fights are all, like I said before, I think the theme of this tier, until we get to the last, that I have more theoretical experience with, admittedly, but still. This fight is just, it has nothing weird going on, really, that makes it terrible or anything. But at the same time, I do feel like it is a bit of a padfest fight, right? Where it's not very difficult.
Yeah, that's probably fair enough. I think, it maybe could have been a little bit harder for where it was in the raid. But I'm not sure if you were supposed to go Soul Render or Remnant first in like their vision, so I'm not sure if it should have been like a 4 or 5 boss difficulty. It probably could have been a little bit harder, but I think it was okay in terms of difficulty.
No, I think it's a good fight.
There wasn't any weird overlaps, which again, yeah, as you mentioned, is kind of the theme of the tier. And speaking of weird overlaps, Painsmith Rasnal. This was like the first time we encountered something they did a lot this tier, where they stopped bosses from casting abilities if they were below a certain health percent.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, the idea with that is, of course, to make it
more
less
generous,
punishing.
yes.
But it ended up being the opposite, because it means you can't stop in that when. Like, yeah.
I think if you're going to do that, you need to punish more with like overall enrage timers. So like if the enrage timer on each phase on Painsmith was like tighter, so you actually had to optimize DPS, but you still had the like grace period where it would stop casting certain abilities, then it would have been much better. As it was, you kind of just stopped DPS for as long as humanly possible to get back cooldowns and it kind of semi-trivialized the fight while also making it extremely annoying to play. But outside of that, like this was a fight that was really, really good on heroic. I was a huge fan of it on heroic, and then it just.
I think that this fight on heroic looked like it would be a really good fight, but I think that I don't know, like the DPS stops makes fights way easier. Honestly, it removes a lot of the passive difficulty because it just becomes mechanic checks basically, and then like burst,
Yes.
which is much harder to screw up. So it moves. I guess this is like my eternal point that I bring up basically every context, but it's like it removes difficulty from you playing your spec, which I think and makes it more about executing, the boss mechanics correctly, which I personally think is just it creates bad design. It's a bad design, right?
Yeah.
Where the difficulty is in the wrong place.
It's not really why I enjoy WoW encounters. Like where I've always enjoyed WoW encounters is the difficulty of like playing my spec well while also dealing with the mechanics. Whereas this kind of removes the spec. Like I'm pretty sure that you could just have a couple of people just completely AFK each phase and you'd be fine until last phase, and that's just a bit silly. Like that isn't how a fight should work. But it is what it is. Guardian of the first ones. This fight was a fucking disappointment.
I think it's supposed to be a patchwork. Like,
it's supposed to be a patchwork DPS.
It's undertuned, I think.
And then it just is definitely not. Like with people one tanking, with people like 6 healing. A patchwork fight being 6 healed. Is a mess.
I think that's really all there's to that, right? There's not a lot more to talk about in the fight.
The mechanics weren't particularly interesting. It was just a fucked fight. Like it was far too easy. It was what, like 7th in the tier, and it was like a 5 pull boss. Yeah, I think almost all guilds killed Guardian of the first ones the same night they killed Painsmith, unless they killed Painsmith last pull of the night. But hey, unfortunate. It does happen sometimes. I mean, we had Xavius back in Nighthold.
I think it's just the normal. Like they probably just underestimated how much DPS the domination sets would give, and they just completely trivialized any tuning they had.
Yeah. I mean, I had to talk to some people, and they were talking about how much of tuning is kind of just a bit of guesswork, and then stuff happens like domination sets just being randomly buffed by an enormous amount the week before the tier, and next thing you know, who knows what's going on.
I feel like it happens a lot. I feel like they are often, and I mean, it doesn't have that they're often late with tuning stuff like significant power sources, right? Like trinkets or traits in the past or essences or whatever it is.
Yeah. So we've got the next 2 bosses now. This is where the raid, I think, kind of got really bad. This is when the raid started to struggle. So Fate Scribe is the next one. This fight was another fight where tuning was kind of fucked up, but this time it was like tuning on the timing of the mechanics. It was so generous with how you could spin the orbs around that it kind of removed any of the like complicated aspects of the fight.
Yeah, but I agree with that. But I also do wonder if that would even have made encounter actually more enjoyable to do, or if it just would have made it into Maiden.
It would have made it. It would have made it. I think it would have made it a lot harder. I don't know if it would have made it more enjoyable. For sure,
it would have made it harder, but I don't know if it makes it a better fight if it's harder, right?
No, I can see where you're coming from. It kind of is just a boss you want to be.
Depends what you like.
It kind of is just a boss you want to be off ASAP.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think these last 3 bosses are really when this tier kind of falls apart. Because up until this point, like the fights are fairly well designed, but have like issues with DPS stops. And I think these last few fights are, for the most part, actually not great designed and have issues with DPS stops. So Fate Scribe, not a whole lot to say about it. It just ended up being a bit too easy. It it was mostly sort of a one-night boss for most people.
Honestly, I feel like this last 3, even in heroic, have the same issues. It's just not as noticeable. Like
Yeah,
this tier really does weaken a lot toward the end.
yeah, definitely. The last 3 bosses, they have similar issues in heroic. So Fate Scribe, Kel'Thuzad. I wasn't in on Kel'Thuzad, but having talked to everyone and watching streams, this looked like the least fun fight anyone's ever played. It was the most DPS stop fight I've ever seen.
Yeah, but this entire fight is just a big gimmick. Like, there isn't too much to say, right? Everything is gimmicky. Literally everything is about gimmicks with ads and like stuff.
It was weird.
And DPS helps, and
yeah. I really enjoyed this fight on heroic. Like I was really hyped for this fight. This fight looked dope on heroic, and then the mythic one is just stop DPS for forever. I mean, they hotfixed the tank trinket cheese, but the fight was still fucking Gouda. It was extremely stinky cheese. DPS stopping upstairs, DPS stopping downstairs. Yeah. I don't think I've ever looked at the log for this fight and seen like lower activity percentages on like a properly played fight for everyone. Just a complete mess of a fight. I think Feral would have been really good here though. Having CDs for intermission and being able to like stop DPS pretty well because so much of our damage is in bite.
would have been good, yeah.
Would have been good. Unfortunately, it's
If
another
the fight
fight.
was good.
Yeah, it would have. Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, the fight is a mess, and you stop DPS, and DPS doesn't matter, and yay. Right. So Sylvanas. I've never had less fun on a heroic fight than I did on heroic Sylvanas.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair.
It was so thoroughly underwhelming, underinteresting. The phases seem utterly pointless. Why does phase 2 exist? Why does the intermission exist? And why is it so long? Why is the intermission from phase 1 to phase 2 actually just like a full minute?
This fight just feels like a complete art. So this is like, oh, we need to make a long fight because epic, and we have just padded this entire fight with so much extra stuff that just doesn't need to be there at all. Like, I don't understand at all what's so cool about like fighting ads on fucking platforms and walking over bridges, right? Like, I understand that it can be made difficult, but that's not the point, right? Like, I don't understand why an end boss has to be long with a bunch of filler content. That seems really, really strange, but there you go. That's Sylvanas.
I think it was a really good fight for Feral. I think there's actually a lot of stuff you can talk about for Feral on this because, like, especially with Celestial, you get a lot of space to use like utility convokes or different form convokes. So there's a couple of spaces where you can like resto convoke for a bit of healing. There's a really good Boomkin convoke spot as you're starting the intermission. I mean, you're not quite a proper Boomkin, but you're probably one of the better non-Boomkin specs. This was kind of a fight which Boomkins just eradicated any having to deal with arrows because they just have the only spread cleave niche in the entire game and just soloed the entire room worth of arrows.
That's also the type of difficulty that I don't know if anyone tried pulling it on heroic the first week before they nerfed it for big group sizes, and the arrows had like 200 billion% health for no reason.
Yeah.
That type of difficulty is not fun for anyone, except maybe the Boomkin. I don't know, but even then, it's not like Boomkin spread AOE is like extremely fun to play. Like, it's pretty,
It's really weird how I feel like the easier version of arrows was in Mythic. I feel like the arrows you dealt with on Heroic being randomly spread around the room were actually significantly harder to deal with than the version we had on Mythic, where they were kind of all in clumps. Or maybe it's slightly better designed the way it was in Mythic, because you can actually have like a warrior or something cast spells on them to bop some arrows.
I definitely think they should probably have been grouped.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a weird fight. I think it's also like I feel like this fight has like okay fundamentals, especially after they fixed the most obnoxious stuff. I just think it's long for the sake of being long. It feels kind of arbitrary, and I don't feel like it adds much to the fight.
Yeah.
Like, if you imagine you skipped phase 2 entirely and went from 1 to 3, I think this fight is just better.
I think I agree. I think it would have been a much more cohesive fight, and it would have been less annoying to get to like 11 minutes into the fight and then wipe to something silly. That's such a frustrating situation to happen. So yeah, if phase 2 didn't happen, I think this would have actually been almost a good fight, because phase 1 isn't too bad. Phase 4
No.
is phase 3 is actually quite interesting. Also, the issues with lag on this fight, man. Lag on pull, lag during the fight. What a mess of a fight. Just every time you pull the boss, the first 4 globals are just queued up. They will happen simultaneously. That's another issue with the fight. I think it's a really good Feral fight. I think Feral is like borderline perfect for that fight. If
It
Feral,
does
as
play a lot
discussed, yeah,
into the strengths of spec for sure, I think.
if Feral had Brutal Slash from either Antorus or Nighthold, I think it just would have been the best spec in the entire game on this fight. Like, better than Boomkin, unironically. It would have hit, like, everything we did well so successfully. Like, single target, some burst AoE stuff going on, good mobility, Stampeding Roar is actual utility on this fight. It would have been so close.
It is funny how Stampeding Roar is always, useful whenever people bring druids for the reason, and not useful whenever people are not bringing druids.
I do agree.
It's weird.
On fights where it's good, it's really good, and then yeah, but there's definitely a degree of finding uses for it.
Yeah.
Finding uses for the utility you're taking. I don't think that's discussed really enough in terms of like a value of utility. But hey, so how is Feral performing in Sanctum? As kind of hinted at, I think it's doing pretty well. I think the fights are really good for it. If DPS mattered more, I think it would be even better. But as it is, it's pretty tanky. It has solid burst. I think it's debatably one of the best specs in the game for a few of the fights. It's just unfortunate that DPS matters so little that there's very few fights where you actually have to optimize your DPS. So you can just take utility or ranged or other stuff.
More healer.
More healers, exactly. We've never had so many tiers with like 6 heal fights. Does make me wonder how guilds with less healers are coping with that, because it's been kind of rough. So Feral's doing pretty well in Sanctum of Domination. Obviously, this tier we got Celestial Spirits. That was POG for us. For those who don't know, obviously it's the makes your convoke 1 minute cooldown, but it only costs 75% of the spells it would normally cast. Good legendary. You've been playing with it a bit, Zan, on your ult.
Yeah, I mean,
Any thoughts?
I think I just think this legendary is one where it makes the damage so convenient. Like, it's very, very rare that you end up in a situation where like a 1 minute like burst cooldown like combo of the strength for convoke feels bad. Like, I feel like on most fights you can make it fit pretty well, and that just makes it so nice to play with, right?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think it's strictly optimal, right, in every situation, but it's like it's gonna feel like it just because there's like no reason to really remove it when it's so good, It's basically, I guess the floor on it is very high.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I definitely think the point about it not being potentially optimal in all fights. So I've talked about this with a couple of people, especially with how prominent DPS stopping is. I do think there's a few fights where Drought or even Frenzy Band might actually just be the better option. But all of those fights are tuned poorly, so it doesn't actually matter whether or not you have the optimal legendary. And people enjoy playing Celestial so much more that it just ends up overrepresented compared to, I think, what its like relevant strength is.
Yeah, and I think also a thing it has on Drought, which matters a lot, is that
You're not punished for hitting other targets.
Yeah, exactly, and it makes it so you don't even need to worry about that, right? You don't need to think about, oh, is this ad? Does this change? Can I rake this? You just remove all of that hassle, and you just like, yeah, I just do whatever, right? I can always rip an ad that shows up, it's fine. It doesn't.
Yeah, I very much I do agree. Stuff like going back to Nathria, the Nathrius, where it was like you had the sword that you could hit as well, but then you also had the lieutenants, you had the little lads. Being able to like not have to work out whether or not it's efficient to rip them or rake them, or in the end it did kind of just end up being rake them all. But because obviously if you're playing Drought, as soon as you rake one, you might as well rake them all.
Yeah.
But yes, it's definitely a value of it being able to hit other things without having to drop your.
I think just removing, just removing the fact that you don't need to be concerned about it is valuable to a lot of people. So people are just gonna be like, oh, if it doesn't super matter, like of course I'm just gonna use this. It's not gonna be bad, basically.
Yeah, and it's there's definitely a degree of it can high roll.
Yeah,
Like I've
but
seen some big high rolls on it. Like I had a
it
5 bite plus feral
absolutely can high
frenzy.
roll, and I do think the way Convoke works is a little bit weird and like boxy, right? But I do think it probably has better high roll than it should in paper.
Yeah, definitely.
But I would say in theory, I think Dra has a very, very high roll as well. Yeah, actually, probably a higher high roll. It's just that that's going to be so rare that you actually high roll like 2 minute convokes in a row or something.
Yes. Yeah. When you get two, if you
Whereas,
potentially got like 2 2 minute, like 6 or 7 bites, I have to check back to Buff Me's numbers, see if it's actually possible to get 7 bite, but 6 bite you can definitely get. But even like,
I think you can get 7 bites with 2 minutes, but it's very, very,
I think
very
you might be
rare.
able to. But even like Celestial, I've had like back to back 5 bites with one of them having a feral frenzy, which is
Yeah,
kind of ludicrous. That's definitely more value than a single convoke, unless you gig a high roller.
yeah,
High
for
roll
sure,
the 2 minute.
for sure. And
But
that those convokes are so powerful. And it's kind of weird with Celestia because it's funny because he was so weak when he was 50%
yes,
duration, but now when it became 75, it's so much better.
yeah, the way that Convoke adds up what it's going to cost,
Yeah,
the extra 25% is disproportionately more valuable than either the 50% beforehand. But yeah, we've talked about Convoke before and how the black box RNG method that they are currently using is definitely a little bit odd. And it, like you've mentioned before, that it's weird that they'd go that route when they could do something so much simpler and so much simpler and so much more
yeah.
reliable. Just
I don't understand Convoke's design at all. Like it's well, I understand how it works, I guess somewhat, but I don't understand why they designed it like this. I don't understand what's so cool about it randomly, doing random stuff. I don't mean that as in casting random abilities, that's fine, but like why it has to be super complex with its spell selection, I don't understand that at all, you know. But hey,
really, yeah, really, it should just be like several lists and then just pick one of the spells from the list.
yeah, exactly.
It would make so much more sense. But hey, it's a good
It's a
legendary.
cool ability in a way, but yeah, it is a very good legendary.
Yeah, it does make you feel good when you get the big like 5 bite plus feral frenzy, but then occasionally you do look down and you see a 1 bite and you're like, man, now I'm sad.
Yeah, double 1 bites in a row. It's actually terrible.
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely a degree of that. So talking about Celestial Spirits, obviously Celestial Spirits is a big boost to Night Fae. But even so, technically, Necrolord does seem slightly higher than Night Fae. So obviously, like, there's some questions there. Obviously, some people like have an idea of where I'm going with this, but Necrolord seems slightly higher than Night Fae, but everyone plays Night Fae.
Yeah,
Obviously, there's some reasons behind that. So burst is inherently more valuable, and especially with Celestial, Night Fae does burst just significantly better than Necrolord does. Um, there's also issues with AOE. So while Night Fae isn't great on AOE, especially compared to something like Kyrian or Venthyr, which would technically probably be better in AOE, it does have significantly more AOE value than Necrolord does. You played Necrolord at the start of the expansion, didn't you?
I mean, not really. I leveled with Necrolord, yeah, and then I swapped the Night.
um, but as people will know, it does also have issues with Adaptive Swarm. Is kind of a bit of a mess of design. So a lot of the times in practice, you don't get the performance in raid that you would from Sims. Much more so than a lot of people will point this out for a lot of specs, but for Necrolord it's a lot more relevant because you have other people in the raid. So your adaptive swarm can bounce off, it can disappear.
Yeah, I mean, so the adaptive swarm has a bunch of really dumb mechanics to it, like the travel time, the max range, and stuff like that. I think honestly, this ability, like the idea is to buff dots, that's cool, but I think that surely this concept can be done in a better way, like that makes it more useful and less random, you know?
Yeah,
But
it definitely needs a relook at. I think there's a couple of ways you
because
could do it.
this covenant can be good, by the way, for Feldroids, as much as people meme it. Well, other than the people who really love it, which fair enough to them, but you know, I'm saying like this ability could be made so much better, I think, and it would just be a good ability. Like,
Yes, it's very close.
yeah,
I was saying the other day that I think really there's like you could make Necrolord into a viable raid covenant. I specify raid here because it's significantly easier to make Necrolord starve damage good in raids. You can make Necrolord a viable raid covenant with like 3 changes. And it wouldn't fix all of the issues it has, but I think you could get it to the point where it sees play.
yeah,
So obviously, it's interesting to consider like what DPS difference Necrolord would need to be above Night Fae in order for it to like for you to like give up the burst. I think at like 5-6%, you'd probably start having people swap.
I think 5% easily. I think you definitely swap for 5% because if you think about it, maybe it's not correct strictly at 5%, but I think a lot of people would just because that
I
would be
agree.
basically a point where you'd have to have it to parse. So
Yeah,
if for no other reason, that would be
even if
good
it
enough.
wasn't technically better for progress, which I think it might still not be at 5% with how good Convoke at 1 minute is on some of these fights, I think you'd still potentially swap. But like so if you just made some changes to it, it could actually be good. Like if you buffed Feral Frenzy by a fuck ton, or buffed Adaptive Swarm's impact on Feral Frenzy, then you could use Feral Frenzy as some kind of burst tool, which would like mimic 1 minute Convoke. Obviously, it would probably be significantly weaker because 1 minute Convoke is kind of bonkers. But like that would be a fairly simple change that kept Necrolord playing pretty similar to it does, while also making it significantly more valuable for
What I
raids.
don't understand is why is an ability that is called a swarm a single target ability? Like, how does that make sense? Like,
I agree entirely. This is my bees rant.
yeah. Like, I don't understand how can a swarm not spread to multiple targets? Like, what? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's baffling from the like semi-meme lore perspective there that it does just apply to a single target.
Because imagine if this ability is just 30 or 45-second cooldown. That is like 5 stacks, and if there's one target, they go on, and you can use them on friends or on foes. And if there's one target, you know, all those stacks go on one target, and it's like, say, 15% dot damage per stack, you know, for say 10,
Yeah,
15 seconds. And if there's 5 targets, you know, they spread to 5 targets, right?
that's
Imagine that.
that's an interesting alternate
Like,
design. Yeah,
there's many ways you could go with this.
yeah,
That it's a very similar concept, but instead they went for this really weird mechanic that it feels a bit like Convoke. Like they just made a very complex design for the sake of it, without there being any like good gameplay reason why.
and it's really short-sighted as well because now they have like this weird position where people like it and they have to somehow make it good, while its issues and what makes it bad are all stuff that makes it sort of clunky and messy, and it's not something they can just like tune up numerically. Well, I guess you can tune everything numerically by just buffing it a fuck ton, but in order to make it good mechanically, you need to actually make changes to it. So you've just like amplified your development required in order to make something work. Yeah, it also has an issue with it dropping off. Like, I'm sure we've got some of the Necrolords who are listening now will have experienced their Necrolord adaptive swarm jumping to a range to then moves more than 25 yards away from the boss, and your lovely 5-stacked adaptive swarm just disappears into oblivion, and you're just extremely sad about it. I'm not sure if you're more sad about that or like a 1-bite convoke back to back, but it's definitely it's definitely a contender.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's yeah. But Necrolord is kind of interesting because it's a very dot-oriented spec, and dot-oriented specs kind of just don't exist in the game at the moment. Like even stuff like Shadow, Affliction Warlock, Boomkin, which has historically been semi-dot related. They just don't do a lot of dot damage. Dot specs kind of just don't exist a lot. So
Which is really just a symptom of the fact that burst is so dominant in this game that it's very hard to make a spec good without it being overpowered on a patchwork fight that is sustain oriented, right? Because if you're a sustain DPS spec and you're like 1% better than a burst spec, then you're worse than a burst spec.
exactly.
This is typically true.
Exactly. Because
and of course that's made even worse by if you're DPS stopping at any point and your sustained DPS spec is narrowly better than the burst spec, well, the burst spec is beating you because you were DPS stop.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Burst is just inherently more valuable than sustain because burst is more amplified by things.
Yeah, and it just you get it instantly, right? Whereas so you get it instantly, and then the cost of that is that you can't use it for 2 minutes or 3 minutes or whatever. But if you're gonna stop after a minute and just wait, then there's basically no cost to it at all. There's no drop.
Yeah, it's part of why obviously molding so hard at Boomkins complaining about all their damage being in 3 minutes. Or I'm sure it's frustrating that outside of those 3-minute cooldowns, you're not doing a whole lot of DPS. It kind of just is better for you as a spec.
It feels bad though.
It does feel awful. But
yeah,
man, it's just so much better to be stuck in cooldowns. And sure, it's better to be stuck in short cooldowns, but the stronger the cooldown, the better sometimes. And hey, you get to do fun stuff like healing outside of your cooldowns. I enjoy that.
I mean, yeah, utility.
Utility. Do you love utility? It's actually quite valuable this tier. I think there's a few fights where you can get a lot of value out of healing, which is kind of cool. I actually do kind of like that utility. I'm sure it makes healers
you
mad.
You don't need to target anyone when you spam it.
Okay, sure. Maybe it could be a little bit maybe it could be a little bit more interactive, but yeah. It's it's a good one. Right. So obviously we talked a bit about Necro and how burst not. So interesting question. Could you design a modern, it doesn't have to be feral, but a modern dot spec that oriented around dots? Because obviously Blizzard seemed to be struggling with that concept. Like we've talked a bit about whether or not dot specs are inherently good or inherently bad and like what the disadvantages are. So to a degree, I agree with your point about how you have to make a dot spec that dealt sustained damage and not burst damage just better on patchwork, because otherwise it's good.
Yeah, there's a handful of ways you can go with it, right? But the best examples of a dot spec like that being extremely powerful are either, depending on how you define dot spec, something like fire, which isn't a dot spec at all, but like it spreads dots, and the fact that they spread makes them viable on AoE, or very powerful, I should say, on AoE, right? That's a way you can make a dot spec powerful. If like you basically get to do forcing a target on multiple bot targets, but that becomes a very niche thing, which is extremely powerful. Like you see this with like Affliction in Antaurus, for example, on the council fight there, where like they're just so far ahead of everyone else or every non-multi-dot spec, just by the nature of being able to basically multiply the damage per target. Or you could also, I imagine, make something like Surrender to Madness Shadow from Legion as well, which is also technically a dot spec, right? But it becomes a Giga Ramp spec, which does obscene damage, right? But both of these examples are overpowered. Like that's kind of the issue, I think, with dot specs. So the way you would have to the way you would have to balance a dot spec, I think, is probably make it a bit cooldown based and have dots that can't be maintained 100% of the time. So, which is probably what people like about dots.
I do think you bring an interesting point, which is that what do people mean when they talk about dot specs? Like, do they mean a spec which just deals its damage through dots, or are they referring to how it plays? I'd like to think that it was people care more about how the spec plays than how it deals damage. Yeah. So as your fire example, while fire was technically a dot spec, it dealt its damage through dot. I don't think that's really what people are talking about when they talk about a dot spec, because it didn't play around dot maintenance. It was kind of just a byproduct of normal play.
Yeah.
Or arms warrior with deep wounds, that kind of thing.
That's the thing. I feel like what we like when we talk about dots is maintaining a bunch of stuff, right? That's the spinny plate meme, right? Basically, that's what people want with dots. They want to maintain a bunch of stuff. That's really the gameplay most people want when they want a dot spec.
Agreed. Yeah.
And so I think the way you would make a modern dot spec work that it's still around that would be with, well, either snapshotting or something akin to snapshotting, or some kind of cooldowns that interact with the dots, right?
You can even do both
It's
cooldown related snapshotting that interact with the dots.
sure. But those are the ways there, really. Like, you need to make it so that you can still do the burst. You need to be able to do fast setup on targets, and you need to be able to do a lot of burst. And ideally also AoE burst. And all of these things are not very natural for a dot spec mechanically, right?
No.
It's doable, of course, but all of these things are not like what you would imagine a dot spec has. And that's the issue. This is why like dot specs are bad, right? Because they are usually very hard to, it's hard to have maintained gameplay. They can also instantly set up on another target. That you can do that, but then it kind of devalues maintenance, right? When you can just press one button and set up everything.
Exactly. Yes. So you need to like lock it behind a CD or something, and then it becomes an issue with being stuck to CDs. I do think a good example of a modern dot spec that ended up really good was Nyalotha Assassination Rogue with Exsanguinate as burst, and then they had some stacking Fan of Knives. So I think that's probably the best recent example that demonstrates that it is something that's possible to do. But there's definitely some constraints you need to get past, which is, as you mentioned, some kind of ability to switch, some kind of ability to deal burst. And it's hard to do the dot maintenance playstyle with burst.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, it's easy to make dots. You can make dot gameplay that is bursty. You could have a ramping dot, like stacks. So you could have. There's all kinds of ways to go with that. You can make something like Exsanguinate, yes, absolutely. But the problem with all of those designs is that it's not. It kind of goes against what most people like with dots, right? It goes against the maintenance gameplay a lot of the time, and that the solutions are typically kind of ruins a bit of the concept. And I think that's the main issue that Blizzard runs into a lot when they try. Admittedly, I don't necessarily think they're trying their hardest to make the dot specs very good, but so there might be solutions, but I do think that there's a limited number of solutions in the current like paradigm of what is valuable for DPS specs.
I do think there needs to be. So while I think that it's, again, I do think it's possible to make a modern dot spec that works. I do think that there needs to be a slight paradigm shift in terms of how the game is designed as a whole.
Yeah,
like cooldowns need to be slashed, because at the moment, in the past, like cooldown burst was like a niche that Fire Mage or Sub Rogue had. It was something that they brought that was part of their value. Whereas now every spec is like that. Cooldowns are just, as a whole, across the board, far too strong. I do think that's an important, or that would be a big first step in addressing like the value of specs.
but that also goes to like, but it is a wider point, right? Like, it does go into, for example, the DPS stop thing we whined about in the raid section as well, where if you're stopping DPS, then your sustained DPS, or if the sustained DPS you're doing isn't that relevant to whether you beat the boss or not, right? Then you being very good at doing sustained damage over time is just not very valuable, fundamentally. And that's a problem with dot specs have even more than others, just because we are automatically a dot maintenance spec becomes very strong sustained damage, right? That's its niche.
To. Yeah.
And if that's what it's good at, then that needs to be valuable. And if you are stopping DPS, or if the fight isn't very hard in the sense of you don't gain much, like you don't make the fight much easier by doing more sustained damage, then that is fundamentally less valuable, right? So then we talk about, how do we fix this, right? We can make a strong burst cooldown. Absolutely can do that, right? Like I said, Surrender to Madness was the strongest burst spec in the game, undoubtedly in that tier. But, and I mean, it exists now, but it's nothing like its Shadow Burst form itself, right?
Yes.
So obviously it's doable, but it's doable in a way where it probably is very, very overpowered, right? When your sustained damage thing can compete with burst specs, then you are overpowered, and that's the problem.
And
That's the
either you
problem.
need
Like,
to either you need to do that, or you need to just make them do more baseline throughput so that you're dealing with the fact that you don't have the burst.
yeah, exactly.
Because don't seem to be big fans of that. They seem to be trying to keep everything within a bracket, despite different classes, different strengths.
Yeah, and obviously that's true, right? If Feral did 10% more damage than Fire or whatever, well, that it probably does this tier, but anyway. If it does 10% more damage than a burst spec, right? Then yes, obviously maybe you could have a discussion about is 10% more sustained damage done more valuable than whatever burst this person brings. Now, it's a bad example this tier because Fel obviously has a lot of burst this tier, right? But if we're talking about like Necrolord Fel, for example, if it did 5-10% more damage patchwork on an actual 5-minute patchwork, then it's an interesting discussion. But Blizzard won't balance it. They won't make the difference that big. If they ever make a difference, it would be a couple of percent, and that's just not enough. It's just not more valuable in practice at that point, like basically ever. And it won't even bear out in the numbers in actual raid, just because, like, imagine you die, with a minute left. Well, it matters a lot more if you sustain damage than if you burst and have already bursted.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff like that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And kill times you have just gotten another cooldown, stuff like that as well. In practice, it just makes it so that it's so hard to balance this out completely when burst is so valuable.
Greed in time. Right. I think we've covered all of our specific topics that we wanted to talk about. So we had some questions that we'd had people ask that we can go through. So the first one is a question by Altdorf, who asked, you can change one existing / create one new talent for Feral. What is it? So I know you and I have discussed like changes to Feral or talents and things like that before. I think we've even discussed some of them on Cat Chat. But if you had to pick one in the current context of the game, one change or one addition, what would it be?
Specifically for talents.
Specifically for talents.
It's hard to pick which one is the most important one, because it's really like there's a bunch of talents I would like to change.
I'm sure I can think of at least one that I would change most of all, at least personally.
Yeah, I
But
mean
it is
the
a tricky
problem
one.
is yes. So like it is a tricky one, not because it's hard to come up with what I would like to change, but because there's so many things, it's hard to pick one. Like the most obvious thing is that Scent of Blood has never been picked ever by anyone since this talent rework. So like that talent just doesn't exist basically on the tree, which I think is I have a lot of ideas of what you could do with that talent to make it good, but I would also like to delete Sabertooth from the game.
You only get one choice.
I know.
Yeah, I know, that's the tricky part, isn't it? Scent of Blood being good would be probably... Yeah. Honestly, I think as much as I would love to just send Sabertooth to the Shadow Realm and never see it ever again, I think in the current landscape of Feral, the single best change you could make to make it a good spec would be to like triple, quadruple the damage of Brutal Slash and also like double or triple the CD.
Yeah.
I think that is the single best change currently. In a theoretical world where I could do
From a
whatever I
power
wanted, it'd be
level
different.
thing, yeah, from a power level thing, like getting us burst AoE is very, very clearly the best thing you can do for the spec. Like that is the by far biggest weakness, and patching it up, even if we don't become amazing at it, which doing that change to BRS, basically bringing it back more to like a Nighthold-esque tuning level, would dramatically improve the specs burst AoE, right?
Yeah. I actually just think it also makes it play far more interesting on single target with fitting Brutal Slash into Tiger's Fury, or actually thinking about where you're spending your Brutal Slash charge as opposed to now where I kind of just send them whenever.
Yeah, makes sense. That's a good change.
I
think I thought about it a bit more. I think the one change I would make right now would be I would change Savage Roar. I would reduce the duration of Savage Roar considerably, and I would make Savage Roar I would make Savage Roar basically a stronger ability in a shorter duration. I think that immediately would make it more interesting to use.
Are you thinking like a cooldown type thing, or are you thinking just like much harder maintenance?
Ideally, I would probably, if I freely changed, I would make it so that Savage Roar increased the speed dots tick when you use it. Like give it say a 30-second cooldown or something like that, and then when you cast Savage Roar, depending on combo points, it has duration, and it makes dots tick twice as fast, or something along those lines while it's up, right? So it's kind of exsanguinate-y. That's what I would do with Savage Roar, I think.
Fair
Because it would
enough.
make it so that it would change the pacing of the spec a lot when you had it, which I think is good, and it would freshen it up a lot.
Yeah, I can be down with that.
Would
Definitely
also
be
work
an
pretty
interesting
okay in
space.
AoE.
Yes, yes, it would. I think that would be an interesting way to go with that. I think you'd have to move the row it was on, because it then kind of wouldn't really fit where it was.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's fine. Maybe we can send Sabretooth to the Shadow Realm at the same time.
To be fair, does any of the talents on that row except Soul fit on that row with Soul?
I think Incarnation does more so after the Berserk change than it did before the Berserk change.
But it's 20% energy cost, right? It's pretty underwhelming.
It's underwhelming and it's undertuned, but I definitely think it has more of a thematic place on that road than it did before.
Yeah, I guess.
Like before, when it just made the stealth, which just essentially was more damage. It was extremely weirdly placed there because that row is like the energy row and it was a damage talent. But with the energy change, I think it's undertuned but in the right place. And they've tried to make Savage Roar more in the right place with making it give energy, but I don't think that's the direction you go with Savage Roar.
I don't. It just becomes too similar to Soul, I think. Like when you increase. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
So it's kind of a bit of a mess. But okay. I think I can go with that one. Right. So this was actually a really interesting question. Somebody called Gerian asked, which is, what is something that an average level feral player doesn't do that top tier feral players do? And I think this is an interesting one because there isn't really like a magic bullet. I think that a top tier feral player and an average feral player are probably playing pretty similarly in terms of how they're pressing their buttons. But I think the big differentiation is like thinking about the actual fight you're playing as opposed to just the buttons you're playing. So when you're pressing your buttons.
Yeah, like a lot of stuff. So I think that there's two main things, and one is that one, which is, for example, how you're using cooldowns, how you're using abilities when you can get more uptime. You know, if small things that optimize your gameplay, right? This matters a lot. It actually adds quite a bit of DPS, and it adds a lot of consistency. Because if you're just yeeting, for example, your cooldowns, like you will run into a lot of situations where you like lose some of the value, for example, like boss goes into a phase, or you miss a window later on or earlier on and stuff like this, or like even a things like which sounds a little bit opposite to that, but like for example, randomly delaying cooldowns, you know, you end up desync your convoke from your TF, like you end up 10 seconds off and you keep eating them on cooldown, and that adds up to quite a big DPS loss overall, and that happens
Yes.
because
And thinking about like how the fight time is going to impact how you can use your cooldowns.
Yeah.
So on certain fights, like you do want to kind of send it as much as possible in order to maximize, and then on certain fight timers you don't want to. So yeah, I don't think there's really something that's like magic. It's a lot of little things that result in a decent amount of DPS.
And I think that consistency is a big thing also when it comes to WoW, and I think this goes for everyone. Like one of the main things that differentiates skill in WoW is consistently pressing the right thing and you know, consistently doing good decisions. Because it's very easy to fall off, end up in a weird space where you're pressing, where something went wrong and now you're completely off, you know, your rhythm, and you're just doing a lot of wrong things, and it adds up like pretty quickly. Like you can have good pulls, but then you're bad pulls, right? And especially when you factor in randomness, if you're playing correctly all the time, then you will eventually have good random pulls, you know. But if you are screwing up, then maybe you had great random rolls, but you just screwed up the mechanics on that pull, and you didn't end up with a good, number in the end. Like consistency is the key, I think, unfortunately.
Yes, and that's a big part of the reason why you see the same like people near the top of the logs. Because I know people will complain about like RNG or whatever in the game, like bite crits. Yay, I didn't have any bite crits. But like a better player will play consistently and will always be in a position whereby they can take advantage of having decent RNG because they're playing well on every fight. So when they finally do get a good pull, they end up at the top. I think that's something that's undervalued heavily. But that was an interesting one because, yeah, there's a lot of things that make it up. There isn't May's at the top of the meters isn't pressing buttons significantly differently to someone else who isn't. He's pressing them slightly better, and he's pressing them at better timing, and he's thinking more about what he's doing. So a question that we got a lot of is feral complexity. Is feral complex? Does it deserve its reputation as a plate spinning spec? Yada yada yada. All of that kind of stuff that I'm sure everyone's seen before. This is quite close to your heart, so why don't you take this away?
It's an interesting question. Is feral complex? Yes. I guess it is somewhat complex, but the question really is how complex is it compared to other things, right, in the game? And how much complexity do you need to account for to play it at a certain level? Like almost every spec, not every spec, but almost every spec in the game has a lot of complexity when you're actually trying to maximize it to the 99th degree, right? That's the case. There's a lot of small things. How many of these small things do you actually need to care about to do 90% of maximum or 95% of maximum or whatever the benchmark is? And a lot of the time, I don't think that Feral's baseline rotation is particularly complex. I think that it's objectively actually not that complex.
And even now, there are a load of optimizations that even people towards the top of the meters aren't actually doing.
Yeah.
It's but even looking back, I do think the reputation of complexity has been kind of overblown for the last 3, 4 expansions. Even looking at Nighthold Feral, which is the kind of, and we had this discussion fairly recently, which is the kind of like paragon of what people consider as hyper complex feral. Even back then, you could hit the 90% of your rotation, like the 90%ish output, fairly simply just by alternating rip and SR. So if you went rake, rip, 5 shreds or whatever to get your 5 common points, SR, repeat that cycle, 5 shreds, rake, rip, then you'd be hitting pretty much 90% output, which is not actually that much more complex than what we do now. It's just bytes instead.
This is what I think is overrated about Legion's feral rotation. While the Legion feral rotation has a lot more buttons, that is true. So in the sense of it's probably harder to get the muscle memory for that rotation. That is probably true. But the spec itself, like what is important to get right to do damage, this is always a different question, right? But the thing is, so think about owl weaving in the current iteration of feral. Like it's a pretty reasonable DPS increase, owl weave versus doing no owl weaving at all. It's a couple of percent. But a lot of people aren't owl weaving at all. Like a lot of people just aren't doing it. Now this is maybe 3%. Now a lot of the time it's probably more than that on the meters just because those people are probably making other mistakes a lot of the time as well. But if, for example, this is the type of optimization, right? If you account for owl weaving in the current feral rotation, like that adds a lot of theoretical complexity. Like there's like at least 4 different cases for owl weaving, like exactly what owl weaving rotation you do. And you can absolutely screw it up by like, oh, I missed that I had a clear casting proc here, or kept energy there, or like whatever, right? You missed TF by a few seconds and you dropped a use, stuff like this. But I think that was always the case, even in, for example, the Legion feral rotation. What really made people bad at that was because they were trying to do it all at once. They were not thinking like with owl weaving that, oh, I can skip it, it's a couple of percent. They were thinking like, oh, how can I min-maxing maybe get a bite here? Or they were thinking about like maybe, oh, can I what finisher should I use here? And they're missing the fact that they just forgot to apply blood talents, which wasn't very difficult, but you just had to remember the pressure growth, and you missed that on your rip. And then you just forgot about the fact that you lost a lot of damage, Stuff
Yeah.
like this. Like I think overcomplicating it is actually the main thing that makes it difficult for a lot of people. It's not that the spec on the surface is very difficult. But yeah, for some reason, people always look back and think that the past were harder than the present, and I think that people are exaggerating that a lot. And I think even when they look back much further back, like when people talk about how hard ICC Feral is, all I'm gonna say about this is I'm looking forward to when we get to Wrath Classic and a lot of people get to play the ICC Feral spec, because it's a lot easier than people remember. And yeah, that's gonna be very interesting to me, actually.
Yeah, I think the main difference back then was things like access to information.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's a huge part of what makes people think that the past was so much harder. Like, even looking at the time since I've started playing this game, the access to information that is developed is mind blowing. Stuff like raid bots, anyone having access to raid bots and being able to sim their shit is reasonably incredible, considering like where we were even just back in like WOD or MOP. So the access to information has made the game relatively kind of easier, I think, to an extent, because
Yeah, for sure.
you're not having to fight with complexity through obscurity. You have access to the information that you need, and you can use that however you want.
Like with much more powerful tools as well. Like you can check, like workout logs is such an easy to use way for most people now. Can just look at logs and get some information from it, or get help, or look up cooldowns, or what builds people are using. Whereas before it would have been really complicated. There were log sites before as well, but like workout logs didn't give you the information nearly as easily as workout logs do. Just as an example.
No, and yeah, and the previous, like, even Warcraft logs has come so much better.
Yeah.
Even just this expansion, but stuff like its improvement upon stuff like, what was it? Was it World of Logs?
World of
That
Logs.
was yeah, it's reasonably mind blowing how much better the tools are we have now. That's a significant part and why stuff is kind of quote unquote easier. But yes, I do look forward to Wrath Classic and how that'll impact. I'm gonna quit retail, letting you all know now. I'm not actually, but right. So we had another question that we had at the last minute, which was asked by Zanzara. Weird coincidence, which is about how accurate subcreation is. So for those of you who don't know, you're not really missing out. Subcreation is essentially just like, it's an automated information gathering site, which kind of fits in a bit with our discussion about tools earlier, that constructs tier lists, gross, based on automatically gathered data from logs or radar.io. As Zan pointed out before we came on this, Feral is currently the only F tier spec on the Mythic Plus Melee tier list. So how accurate is it really? It's an interesting question. But like, essentially it's all automated logs. So it's stuff that's gathered manually, and then it's some statistical analysis used to rate it. So Feral, by being such a low representation spec, actually kind of has an inherent advantage, because representation is part of the statistics they use in order to evaluate how well something performs. So the fact that so few people are playing Feral, and particularly so few people are playing Feral in keys, drags it down naturally. So at the end of the day, if we want Feral to be higher up, it's kind of just a case of more people have to play Feral and do high keys. There's not much more to say about that in regards to the tier list. But yeah.
It's worth saying with this site and other sites like this is that low representation makes it so that individual random things becomes super exaggerated. So like if you are like, if there's only like 5 people that do like a 20 key with a certain setup, and like 2 of them had like a really bad day and screwed up, and then suddenly, you know, the average is like a lot lower than it might be in reality.
Yeah,
And that's
so it's not even just
super significant.
being downgraded for not as many playing it, it just also has more impact. It's kind of a bit of a perfect storm. Interestingly, Feral is C on the melee tier list for the raid, which is kind of interesting. But again, it's largely, like, if you look at the statistics from the tier, Feral is sitting at 4th overall currently across all bosses. So I'm not quite sure how it's ended up as a C, but obviously the answer is just that it's low representation and it's overly valuing representation, the number of people playing it in terms of how it ranks it. But it is what it is. I think that was the extent of all the questions we had to ask. We had to answer that were interesting. We've gone through our whole topic list, so I think that's us mostly done here. You got anything else to say at the end?
No, not really.
No?
I think we have covered a lot of bases.
I think we've covered a lot of bases. It went
We
kind
should,
of a bit longer than I thought.
yeah, we should probably make the next catch up a bit more
Soon.
yes, then we should strive to make a little bit more frequent episodes than now the past,
Yes.
I don't know.
Well, 9.1.5 PTR should be coming soon, TM. We're looking forward to that, and we'll see what happens in there. So we'll probably do our next episode around when 9.15 PTR comes out, when we get some interesting information about what's coming in that. And
we can say no changes, just to have all the changes happen a day after. Like,
yeah, that did happen a few catch-up episodes ago, didn't it? We said there's no changes, and they made all of the changes literally like a week later, and we had the rush to do a video. But hey, yeah, we'll try and commit to doing one sooner next time. Thank you for listening, and good night.